This section is on the Vikings and the rise of feudalism. So here's the thing. Why didn't the kingdom of the Franks develop into a revived Roman Empire? You may remember in the last video, I tried to emphasize how, the Pope crowns this new emperor, Charlemagne, Charles the Great. And you've got this partnership between church and state working so well in the Frankish kingdom. It seemed like there would be a new Roman Empire, at least in the West. I mean, the East was still doing just fine. So what happened? And a lot of this section is trying to understand what happened and why. Well, first of all, one thing we just have to remember is it's difficult to keep an empire together. It's no easy thing. Empires want to fall apart. They're hard to keep together. And you'll recall, we talked about this earlier, there's problems of distance. Empires are big. People in this time period, the fastest they can go is basically as fast as someone can ride a horse. Empires usually involve lots of different types of geography. And there's lots of geographical barriers, dense forests, high mountains. It can be very difficult to deal with. Language is also an issue. Now, one reason why there was this partnership between church and state, one reason why the Catholic Church emphasized the importance of Latin was that was a unifying force. That was something that could be used to hold together all these different people because it could be a common language between them. So Charlemagne and his successors, they have to deal with the fact that it's difficult to keep an empire together, and they also face issues of distance, geography, and language. But in order for an empire to work, you have to have a centralized government. That's the nature of an empire, or at least one that lasts a long time, has to be centralized. Remember, the Zhou dynasty fell apart because it was decentralized. It had adapted feudalism. In particular, you should be able to tax directly and pay soldiers to maintain an imperial army under central control. If you want to be an emperor, you got to have an army. To have an army, you have to have money. The best way to get money is to tax people directly. Don't rely on nobles to do your fighting or to raise armies. Raise it directly yourself, because armies tend to be loyal to whoever pays them. If this cannot be done, if you can't get resources directly through taxation, if you cannot pay an army that's under your command, the power of the king or would-be emperor will erode. Charlemagne was doing so well, in part because he had an imperial army, and he had officials that were controlled by him. For example, he had civil and church officials that he would send out to make sure that everyone in his empire were obeying the rules, especially other government officials, to make sure they weren't trying to rebel or be corrupt and take money and so forth. So Charlemagne was doing a good job of this. But something happens during Charlemagne's reign that will continue on after he's gone and will plague his successors. The first instance of what I'm going to describe, though, doesn't happen in France or the Kingdom of the Franks. It happens in what is today England. It happens in a place called Lindisfarne in 793 and is recorded in a very important historical document called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And I'll read it to you. Here were dreadful forewarnings come over the land of Northumbria and woefully terrified the people. These were amazing sheets of lightning and whirlwinds, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. A great famine soon followed these signs, and shortly after in the same year, on the 6th day before the Ides of January, the woeful inroads of heathen men destroyed God's church in Lindisfarne Island by fierce robbery and slaughter. So, we have to stress, remember, this is a very religious time. There's a belief in God, and a belief that God will make clear that something bad is going to happen through nature. So that's why you have all this stuff about weird weather patterns and fiery dragons in the sky and so forth. And then you have the terrible thing happen, which is the heathen men, these would be non-Christians, attacking a monastery on Holy Island, Lindisfarne, Holy Island. And this is a modern rendition. These men have come, they've killed the monks, they've burned the church, and they're carrying off all the treasures of the church that have been given it by the king or by pious donations, all the things they used to celebrate Mass to worship God. And of course, who were these people? They were the Vikings. The Vikings are a very serious threat, not only to England, but also to Charlemagne's growing empire. Why? A lot of it has to do with their ships. Their ships are very interesting. They're very fast and they're very mobile. If you look at the ship, you can see it has what we would call a shallow draft. It doesn't go deep into the ocean. They're hard to sail because of that, but the Vikings were good sailors. They're from Northern Europe, lots of ports, lots of places to sail. And they are able to take those ships from places like Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, like I said, Northern Europe, and sail them to England or to France. But here's what makes them especially dangerous. They can sail them up rivers. And one thing that we've talked a lot about in this class is that people like to build cities along rivers. So they're very good at quickly running in, attacking, killing a bunch of monks or whoever, taking their stuff, and then running away. So they're a very serious threat, both to the kingdoms of England and to the Frankish kingdom, the kingdom of the Franks. But there is a fundamental problem with this. Such soldiers are expensive, right? Such soldiers are expensive. So, if we look again, here's another image of these Frankish knights attacking Vikings. As you can see, they're armed with metal armor, with heavy metal weapons, and they're riding horses. So not only do you have to support a human being, they also have to be able to support a war horse, right? Not just any horse can be a war horse, right? A horse that can go into battle. They have to be specially trained, of course. They have to be specially bred in order to become strong enough to carry a knight. And the knight needs also typically more than one horse, right? He will also usually need a riding horse at the very least. You don't ride your war horse to the battle because then the war horse will get tired. So these are expensive. We also have to stress, imagine how difficult it is to learn to fight with a sword. Now imagine how difficult it is to fight with a sword and a shield while wearing armor. Okay? Now imagine how difficult it is to learn how to fight on horseback in a battle while holding a shield and holding a sword and a shield, and also charging and staying in formation with your fellow knights. That's not something that you can do on a part-time basis. You have to do this all the time. So the thing I want to stress here is this. These soldiers are extraordinarily expensive. And here's the other problem. You can't just have them all in the capital with the emperor. You have to disperse them throughout the country so they can respond quickly to the Viking attacks. Right, so not only are these knights expensive to maintain, you can't keep them all in one place. You can't keep them all under the control directly of an emperor. You got to spread them all around so they can deal with the Vikings. And this will lead to what we call feudalism, which is the decentralized control of political, economic, and military resources. And I think this does a pretty good job of illustrating how this works. You have a king who has land. He's the king, right? The king will give a lot of his land to nobles. Right? We'll give them land. They are supposed to offer the king money when he wants it, or other resources, and knights to fight in his battles. Where do they get the knights? Well, they give land to people who will become knights, who will become those mounted warriors we were just talking about, right? These guys are going to get land so they can support themselves, so they can buy that heavy equipment, buy those war horses, and maintain them. But here's the thing: they have to spend their time training. They have to go out fighting and doing military service. So it's not like they can work the land themselves. So they will have peasants, or what we'll talk about later, serfs. Those serfs, they will divvy up some of their land and give it to serfs to work on. And they will promise to give protection to the serfs so that if bandits or Vikings or other raiders try and mess with the serfs, the peasants, the knights will protect them. And you can see how this system works, right? You're supposed to take care of each other. Each person has an obligation, right? The peasants receive land and protection from the knights. They have to give food and service to the knights. The knights receive land from the nobles. They have to offer protection and field military service to the nobles. All that land ultimately, in theory at least, comes from the king, and those nobles, with the help of the knights, have to give the king money or typically resources and knights. So what we have here is a system, a political system built on reciprocal duties. The lord receives land from kings with the promise to give military support and defend their local region. Right? So you're lord of such and such area, Warwick County or something like that. You're in charge of that. And the king gives you that land. You're supposed to defend it. And then if the king has a war or is invaded, you're supposed to help the king when he calls on you for help. The lords give land to knights so they can support and arm themselves. And I just want to point out, here is a knight who is directly in the service of a king, and he's taking an oath to serve the king and receiving his sword. And the idea is that, this represents that he will be serving this king, right? The lords then use the knights to defend the peasants that work their land. And everyone depends on them, right? Because you need food for the whole system to work. Remember, civilization is based on food supply. From bandits and raiders, this would include Vikings. And I want to stress, I use the Vikings as a kind of focus for this. There were also problems with banditry. After the rise of Islam, there were Islamic raids, particularly in southern Europe, that the knights needed to be developed in order to deal with. And the peasants will grow the food needed by everyone and offer it to the knights and lords in exchange for protection. So, like I said, this is a system built on reciprocal duties. Now, the strong point of this, and the reason it developed, is it works well for providing local security, but weakens the central government. Right? The king is giving land out. The king does not have direct control over those knights who are in the service of the Lord. Theoretically, right, those knights swear an oath of loyalty to the Lord, not to the king himself. So the king does not have direct control over resources or the people like the knights. And you may remember what happened to the Zhou dynasty. They had a similar system, and it eventually led to the erosion of their power. Over time, the lords can actually become then more powerful than their kings. Right? If you have a weak king, such as a child king or a very young or inexperienced king, the king can tell the lord, hey, you got to come help me. We're being invaded. And the lord may say, I'm busy. I can't help you right now. And the king has to decide, okay, do I have the resources to force the lord to help me or not? And the lord may just enter up and rebel, or may make the king his puppet, right? So the problem is, because the kings can eventually lose direct control over resources or people, the nobles can get control of them and then do what they want. So there's not going to be any strong central government, no new Roman Empire. Gradually, because of the Viking menace, even though Charlemagne and the Franks were on the way to building a unified kingdom, it's just not going to happen because of these Viking raids, leading to the need for a decentralized political system to deal with the threat of Vikings. No strong central government, no new Roman Empire. The other thing about this, too, is that a lot of the people in the previously we referred to them as peasants, but a lot of them are also what we would call serfs. And serfs are really complex. They're people who are farmers, typically. They're not slaves. Like, typically you can't sell your serfs. And you can't split up a serf family. So, like, if you study American history, one thing that was really bad about slavery, there were many things that were very bad, but one thing that was particularly bad was the division of families. Right? You could have a family where they would be divided and sold to different plantations. Really terrible. You could not do that to serfs. Serfs has rights. They could marry. You couldn't just get rid of one when they got old. You had a duty to protect them. So they're not slaves. Right? You don't directly own them. You can't sell them like you could a horse. But they're also not quite free. For example, it was said that serfs were tied to their land. They couldn't leave. So they couldn't say, you know what, I'm going to go over here and work for this lord. He's going to give me a better job. They couldn't do that. That was illegal. They did it, they could get in trouble. So it's not like they could just go around and do whatever they want. They weren't completely free. If you were free, you could leave. They can't leave. Now, the thing is, though, that is an improvement over the Roman Empire in some ways. One thing is we focus on, there's this decline after the Roman Empire, but large-scale slavery disappeared from Europe. Remember, in the Roman Empire, in many places, it really was a slave society. And while serfdom is not great, it is better than slavery, certainly. But one thing we can recognize is how difficult the situation was for people in Europe during this time of late antiquity, the so-called Dark Ages, that they're trading their freedom for security. Right? The serfs are willing to give this up because at least, even though the lords may, be tyrants, the bandits will just kill them and take their stuff. At least the lords and the knights need the serfs to grow food, so they'll protect them. But there's threats, like I said, from the Vikings, from raiders, and so forth, that they're willing to trade their freedom for security. But in conclusion there, just to make this clear, the need to shift power to local areas to defend people against Viking attacks and other raiders weaken the central government and help prevent the revival of a Western Roman Empire.